Most people have heard the name Nostradamus, associating it with an ancient prophet's uncanny ability to see into the future. Yet very few know anything about the man behind the name. In this video, we discover the real Nostradamus and find out how his predictions became so influential throughout Renaissance Europe and down into our time. Historians have very little to go on when it comes to reconstructing the life of Nostradamus. Apart from a collection of letters, there are only 2 prefaces to his prophecies that were written by the man himself. There is also his will and the writings of some of his contemporaries, one of whom was his son Cesar. Over the centuries, however, the legend that has built around the man has become so great that it is virtually impossible to separate fact from fiction. What is known is that Nostradamus, whose birth name was Michel de Nostradamus, was born in December 1503 in the small French town of Saint-Rémy de Provence, not far from Salon. He was born into an educated and relatively well-off Jewish family. The family had produced doctors and merchants, and unlike many French people at the time, most of Michel's relatives were literate. His great-grandfather had converted to Christianity in 1453. His son, a teen at the time, did the same thing, changing his name from Guy Gassonet to Pierre de Nostradamus, or Peter of Notre Dame. To change one's name to a clearly Christian one, such as Notre Dame, was a common way in those times to publicly announce conversion to Christianity. Life in France was hard for Jews in the 15th century, even those who had converted to Christianity. The days of anti-Semitic riots were a thing of the past, but Jews still had to wear an identifying symbol. If an epidemic or riot broke out, the Jews were inevitably scapegoated. Those who had converted were often accused of being part of a secret cult. One of the children of Pierre de Nostradamus was Jaume, who became a merchant and scribe. In 1500, Jaume relocated from the papal city of Avignon to Saint-Rémy. There he married a young woman named Ranière de Saint-Rémy. Along with her hand came a nice dowry that consisted of a house, field, and an orchard. The couple had 9 children. The 5th was Michel. It has been said that when Michel was around 7 or 8, his maternal grandfather, who was a doctor, noticing that the boy was especially bright, introduced him to medicine and astrology. Whether or not this was the spark for fascination with these subjects, as a teenager, Michel left home and headed for Avignon. His plan was to undertake classical studies in a range of subjects including grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. A few years later, he traveled 60 miles to the southwest to study medicine at the University of Montpellier. Even though he was attending one of the most prestigious universities in all of Europe, Michel was less than impressed with the book-heavy, lecture-focused theoretical approach to learning that he was forced to endure. He was more interested in doing rather than reading and listening, so he spent his time collecting medicinal plants and experimenting with powders and concoctions. He also publicly lambasted his teachers. Nostradamus's outspoken refusal to fit the mold was not pleasing to the university's dean. He excluded Michel from the corporation for practicing the manual trade of apothecaries. As a result, the young man gave up on Montpellier and spent most of the 1520s traveling around southern France, advancing his medical knowledge through his own independent study and observation. Around 1529, Nostradamus returned to Montpellier. Apparently the dean had softened on him, as the records show that he paid his dues and obtained his medical degree at that time. The 24-year-old was a lover of learning, having accumulated a large library. He had also mastered at least 5 languages, including Greek. Nostradamus was, at this stage of life, a man who was straddling French boundaries. He was a devout Catholic, descended from recent Jewish converts. His middle-class family was on the cusp of the elite, but not close enough to join the upper ranks of society. He was an alumni of a prominent university, but had rebelled against its formal style of learning. And finally, he was a physician, but also a constant traveller. Immediately upon graduation, Nostradamus continued his travels. In fact, for the next decade, he lived the life of an itinerant physician, journeying across southwestern France. He was known to have spent time in Bordeaux, Marseille, northern Italy, Turin, Genoa, and Venice. In each place, he met with physicians and apothecaries, astrologers, and city councillors, listening, learning, and absorbing knowledge all the while. At the time, the plague was a major danger to travellers. Between 1451 and 1550, Provence alone suffered 45 years of epidemics. Migrants carried the disease, as did soldiers who marched across the country. Though the death rate was not as high as it had been during the Great Plague of the 14th century, the terrible symptoms were a constant cause of panic. As he travelled, Nostradamus came across the effects of the plague and offered his medical services in a number of towns. In 1546, he wrote a vivid description of the epidemic in the city of Aix-en-Provence. He wrote a pamphlet in which brought together religion, astrology, and medicine in an attempt to explain the plague. He wrote that the epidemic was due as much to divine punishment of sins and wickedness as it did to the changes in positions of the stellar bodies which drew pestilential air into people's bodies. Nostradamus advocated spiritual cleansing, repentance, and living a sensible, moderate lifestyle, as well as the doing of good deeds, plenty of sleep and exercise as the best defense from the plague. He also invented a powder made from ground cypress, red roses, cloves, and other plants, and formed it into a patty that he encouraged people to use to cover their noses and mouths. The effectiveness of Nostradamus's concoction is questionable. What is clear is that he was seen by the local people as a dedicated physician who was risking his life for strangers. Many doctors, fearful of contracting the disease, had fled from the disease, but Nostradamus had stayed. As a result, he developed a reputation as a man of courage and devotion to public welfare. Sometime in the 1530s, the plague struck Nostradamus with a personal vengeance when his wife and 2 children died. Stricken with grief, he continued to travel, moving around southern France and into Italy. In 1545, he was in Marseille helping to fight a major epidemic outbreak. 2 years later, he settled in Salon de Provence. There he married a wealthy widow named Anne Ponsard. They would go on to have 6 children. During the late 1540s, Nostradamus gradually moved away from medicine and into the realms of the occult. In 1550, he wrote an almanac. It became so popular that he resolved to produce a new volume annually. As well as providing weather predictions and calculations of the tides and planting dates, Nostradamus included predictions of the coming year. As a result of the popularity of the almanac, members of the elite class began requesting horoscopes and psychic readings from him. In the mid-1550s, Nostradamus embarked upon the project for which he is most famous, the writing of 1,000 undated prophecies, or quatrains. Because he feared that he would become the subject of attack from the church, he devised a way to obscure the meaning of the prophecies with what was called virginalized syntax, and by mixing up the languages in which he wrote. The quatrains were published in a book that was simply called Prophecies. It received a mixed reception, with some believing that Nostradamus was an outright fake, while others were convinced that he actually had the gift of prophecy. One of his strongest supporters was Catherine de' Medici, the wife of France's King Henry II. She brought him to Paris to draw up personal horoscopes for her and each of her children. In 1560, when young Charles became king, Catherine made Nostradamus the personal physician to the monarch. At the time of his royal appointment, Nostradamus was suffering from gout. The condition gradually worsened, developing into edema. On the evening of July 1st, 1560, he made his final prophecy, telling his secretary "You will not find me alive at sunrise." The next morning, he was found dead, lying on the floor next to his bed. Nostradamus's prophecies developed a life of their own in the years to come. They have been published in more than 200 editions, with more than 2,000 commentaries. The vagueness and lack of dating has made it possible to fit the prophecies to historical happenings after the fact. Today, the division between those who are Nostradamus believers and those who assert that it is all bunk is just as strong as it was when they were first published.